As I'm sure you know, Blender is being developed continually. So, although we started out using the latest version of Blender at the time, which was version 4.1, the latest early releases are now up to version 4.3. And since we want to keep up with the latest development as far as possible, we'll be using version 4.3 from now on.
Several more selection methods exist that, for the most part, have to be executed from within the Select menu's options. Select Mirror selects any element that is the mirror image of the already selected element. As you can see, the originally selected element is deselected. In the last op panel, we can select which axis is to be checked for the matching element. There is no match in the Z direction since the plane is a two-dimensional mesh. By selecting the Extend checkbox, the original element will remain selected. Select Random selects a random set of elements from the mesh. Exactly what type of element is selected depends on the selection mode setting: vertex, edge, or face. This command's last op panel allows us to set the percentage of elements to be selected. 1 being 100%. We can also set the random seed value, which affects what elements are chosen. Finally, we can choose between selection or deselection. Checker Deselect can be used to create a pattern of selected and deselected items in a similar way to the effect we saw in the previous video. To demonstrate, we'll start with a line of selected faces. Now, choosing Checker Deselect will deselect every other face. The last op panel allows us to specify the grouping of the deselected and selected items using the deselected and selected fields. There is also an offset parameter to push the pattern forward or backward. If we start by selecting all of the faces in the grid, Checker Deselect offset the deselection in each row to create a checkerboard effect, hence the name of the operation. More or Less has 4 entries in its submenu. The first 2 of these, which expand or contract the selected elements, we covered in the previous video. Next Active selects the next element Blender thinks we would choose next, based on the order in which we chose the currently selected group. However, its abilities are quite limited. For example, as we can see, it can't predict that we might want the next corner vertex on a cube. Previous Active will deselect the current active element and make the previously selected element the active one. Select Similar has a submenu which changes depending on the type of element we are selecting: vertex, edge, or face. And so we will leave this entry until the next video. Working our way down the Select menu list, we come to Select All by Trait. The first entry in its submenu is Non-Manifold, and only appears when selecting vertices or edges. Before we go any further, we need to explain what the terms manifold and non-manifold mean. To generalize, a manifold mesh is one that fully encloses a space. At a more basic level, every vertex must be linked to an edge, and every edge must be linked to exactly 2 faces. So while the cube, sphere, cone, and cylinder are manifold meshes, the plane is not, since its outside edges are not connected to 2 faces, which is to say, the plane is a non-manifold mesh. So the non-manifold menu option selects all vertices and edges that do not meet the manifold criteria. To show the types of elements this option highlights, we'll use a modified monkey head. Notice that some of the faces on the head are missing, that one of the faces has been inverted so that its back face is on the surface, and that an extra face has been attached to one edge. The last op panel has a list of options which determine exactly which non-manifold elements will be highlighted. All options are selected by default, but we'll deselect them all and activate each in turn to better highlight their purpose. Extend just adds the elements selected here to a previous selection. Wire highlights the edges that are not attached to faces. Where we're in the Select Vertices mode, it's the vertices at either end of such edges that are selected. Switch to Edge Select, and the selection criteria is more obvious. Boundaries selects edges that are attached to only one face. Multiple Faces selects edges that are attached to more than two faces. Non-contiguous selects edges that are attached to two faces, with normals pointing in opposite directions. In other words, where one face is showing a front face and the other a back face. Vertices selects vertices whose edges are not connected to exactly two faces. We must be in vertex selection mode for this option to work. When in edge selection mode, loose geometry selects edges that are not connected to a face. When in vertex select mode, it's vertices that are not connected to edges that are selected. There are no detached vertices in this model. Interior Faces selects all faces where at least one of its edges is connected to more than two faces. Faces by Sides selects all the faces that have the number of vertices specified in the last op panel. The value is in the field labeled Number of Vertices. The second field of the last op panel, Type, gives us a choice of relationships with the previous field. So we can select faces that have a number of vertices equal to the number specified, less than, greater than, or not equal to the number specified. Extend, when checked, adds the newly selected faces to the current selection. The final option in Select All by Traits submenu is Ungrouped Vertices. So this seems like a good point to introduce the concept of vertex groups. When we have selected a complex set of vertices that we may want to reselect later, we can eliminate the need to manually select them in the future by saving the vertices within the selection as a vertex group. For example, we'll start with our grid and select a random set of vertices. To remember the selected vertices, we need to go to the Data page in the Properties editor. Next, under the heading Vertex Groups, we click on the plus sign to create a group name. We can double-click on the default name and type in our own name for the group if we wish. Now we need to click on the Assign button to link the currently selected vertices to the group name. We can have as many groups as we want, and a vertex can belong to more than one group. To reselect a named group, just choose the group name and click Select. Deselect will deselect the vertices of the group from the current selection. And Remove will remove the currently selected vertices from the highlighted group. Which brings us back to the last entry in Select All by Traits submenu, Ungrouped Vertices. This will select all vertices that have not been assigned to a vertex group. Returning to the Select menu, Select Linked Choices are in a submenu. Linked selects every element that has a direct or indirect edge connection to the currently selected item. Notice that this is similar to the Island selection option we looked at in the last video. However, in this case, we need to start by selecting an element rather than merely move the mouse pointer into the area. The last op panel allows us to exclude elements that would normally be selected. For example, if we are using Face Select rather than Vertex or Edge, Clicking on Material would exclude any faces that are assigned a different material from the originally selected face. Shortest path is an alternative way of selecting the elements between two initially selected elements. Linked flat faces selects all the faces in a connected mesh that are in the same plane as the initial face selection. In the last op panel, we can adjust the sharpness field to allow faces at a steeper angle to be selected. Select Loops has a submenu. Edge Loops is best used with Edge Selection mode enabled. Start by selecting a single edge, then Edge Loops. Blender will then select a ring, that is a horizontal loop or half a vertical loop if we are dealing with a sphere. On a grid, it will select a line of edges. On a more complex shape, such as Suzanne, it will attempt to select a loop, but stops when it encounters a tri or n-gon. The last op panel has a ring checkbox. Select this, and the selection changes to a set of edges parallel to the originally selected edge. Edge Rings selects a ring of edges parallel to the selected edge. In other words, the same result as we achieved by clicking in the ring checkbox when using the previous submenu option. Select Loop Inner Region selects all of the items within an enclosed area, which is defined by a set of selected edges. Select Boundary Loop performs the inverse operation to Select Loop Inner Region. With a set of faces selected, it selects the edges around the perimeter of the selected area and deselects all elements within that area. Sharp Edges selects vertices, edges, or faces, depending on what we are working with, where faces are at angle of 30 degrees or more to each other. The last op panel allows us to change the minimum angle required before an edge is considered to be sharp. Side of Active only works when a vertex is selected. To understand how Side of Active operates, we have to imagine an axes set whose origin is at the location of the active element. This option will select all the items along one direction of a specified axis on our imagined axes set. Here, all the vertices along the positive side of the x-axis are selected. The axes set, specific axis, and which direction along that axis items are selected are determined by the parameters in the last op panel. Axis Mode selects the axis set. Axis Sign determines if the selection is along the positive end of the axis or the negative end. The third option, Aligned Axis, only selects items with the same coordinate value as the originally selected item on the axis given in the axis parameter. Threshold specifies how close an item must be to the initially selected element before that item is selected. The two-dimensional plane may give us a clear understanding of this command and its parameters, but let's see the results we get when we use it on a more complex, three-dimensional shape such as Suzanne, the monkey head.